We are ready for chapters 5 to 8. Chapters 5 through 8 continue the condemnation of Israel or Judah for their sin that had been introduced in chapters 1 to 4. And so we've looked at chapters 1 to 4. We're not going to review all of that in the interest of time, but we're going to see basically three things in our study tonight. We'll get to that in just a second. We're going to go over this several times throughout our series as to the kings that we're dealing with, the time period we're dealing with. Isaiah prophesied from about 739, 740 BC. We'll see more about that call tonight, chapter 6, to about 700. Those are approximate dates, not exact dates, but approximate dates, which would put him right here in the period of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. Those are the four kings that are mentioned, by the way, in chapter 1 and in verse 1. And so we're going to talk about those kings. Particularly, we're going to talk about Jotham and Ahaz a little bit tonight. Ahaz more than Jotham. And so those are the kings that we'll be dealing with. But it was during that period, while Assyria is still in power, because you'll notice while this is going on, Israel is going to go away in Assyrian captivity. Babylon is not in power yet. So that's why the Assyrians are going to be in play in our study even tonight. So here is our outline of the book we'll look at each time. And there are two basic thoughts in the book. And that is chapters 1 to 39, judgment from God. This is in the Assyrian period. And the period of, in the Assyrian period, there's conflict and there's victory. More conflict, as we see particularly in chapters 1 to 12. And then we'll look at comfort from God and hope for the future in 40 to 66. So we're right here still in that first section of dealing with the prophecy against Judah and Jerusalem. Now, we'll start in chapter 13 soon, and we'll talk about judgment against the nations. We've talked already a couple of times about the nations section in nearly every prophet. We haven't got there yet. We have a hint at the nations a little bit in tonight's lesson, but that comes in chapters 13 to 23. We're still dealing with the prophecy against Judah and Jerusalem. So chapters 1 to 4 dealt with that primarily, even though there was prophecy of the Messiah. We're going to see prophecy of the Messiah even tonight. But again, as we mentioned last time, there is the dark ground of the sin of the nation, present nation, and then growing out of that is the bright future in the Messiah. And we'll say more about that a little bit later. Three things happen in our study tonight, and here's what we're going to see. We're going to see, I call simply this whole section, the sins of Judah and the call of Isaiah. And so what's going on here is we have the condemnation of Judah for her sins. That's in chapter 5. Now we'll subdivide that as we go along, but that's what chapter 5 is about. It deals with the condemnation, just like chapters 1 to 4. It's a continuation of that. Then chapter 6. Now this is interesting because some prophets put this at the beginning of their prophecy, and others come along and put it a little bit later, and Isaiah is one of those. So we've covered 5 chapters before Isaiah mentions his call. And so here's his call to be a prophet in chapter 6. And then we have the threat of Syria and Ephraim. The nation of Syria and Ephraim would be Israel. That's the northern kingdom. So you have Syria and Ephraim are a threat, and we've talked about that in our introduction. And rather than fearing them, you should fear God. And so we're going to see Ahaz in that. We're going to see Isaiah in that picture. In chapters 7 and 8, those two go together. So let's start with this condemnation of Judah for her sins in chapter 5. Now, just focus on chapter 5 for a little bit, and here's what happens in chapter 5. Three things are going to flow from this chapter. There's the song of the failed vineyard. Some call it a parable, but it's called a song here. The song of the failed vineyard, verses 1 to 7, and then there is a series of 6 woes that I think are directly connected to that failed vineyard, and we'll say how that is connected directly here in just a moment. So here's a series of 6 woes, and then there's judgment from the nation because of these 6 woes. So all 3 sections laced together and fit together tightly. So let's start with the song of the failed vineyard in verses 1 to 7. There are 4 things here that we see concerning the failed vineyard. In verses 1 to 7. We're not sure of the time of the prophecy, as we pointed out in the workbook. That is, we don't know the exact time of the prophecy. Haley suggests that this is probably either in the late days of Jotham, as we talked about earlier, the 4 kings, Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, that it's either in the late days of Jotham or the early period of Ahaz, probably. And that's just based on the history of, it seems to fit that period, perhaps more maybe than some of the other kings. But there is a great deal of conjecture there, even on Haley's part, in dating that. But we're not told in the context of the dating of this prophecy. However, we're sure of the point of the prophecy, and the point of the prophecy is that Israel is like a vineyard that utterly failed and is going to be burned and going to be consumed. They didn't produce the great grapes that they should have. So let's start with verse. There's four things here. Let's start with verses 1 to 3. The vineyard failed. And so he talks about his beloved, and that would be the husbandman, that he has a vineyard. And he says, my well-beloved has a vineyard, I'm reading at verse 1, on a very fruitful hill. The idea of a fruitful hill suggests it's on a hill where it gets sunshine from every direction, so it should have produced fruit. It's a fruitful hill, suggesting that other things on the hill have been fruitful and it's fertile ground. So there's nothing wrong with the ground here at all. So it had every opportunity to grow, it had every opportunity to produce. But besides that, look at verse 2. He tilled it, that is, he dug it up. So as you might have with a garden, you say, well, it didn't produce. Well, did you till it? Did you work it? Well, no. Well, then no wonder. But that's not the case here. He dug it up and he cleared out the stones. So he's cleared it out. It's good ground. And he planted the choicest of vine. It's like planting a garden and you get the best tomato plant that you can put in the ground versus one that looks like it was dying when you put in. He put in the choicest of vine, and then notice his expectation. He built a tower in its midst to watch it grow and to protect it. And so he did everything he could, that is the husbandman, the vine dresser, did everything he could to make it produce. And then he made a wine press in it. Well, if you put a vineyard out and then you put a wine press in it, that is anticipating that things are going to go well. Like if I don't know, if you're planting a garden and you think you're going to produce whatever, or maybe you have an orchard and you're going to plant a bunch of apple trees, and then you build something over here to make applesauce out of, or produce some product from the apples, suggest you're anticipating it's going to go well. Well, that's what this husbandman did. That's what the vine dresser did. He's expecting all things to go well. So now notice at verse 3, though, he says, so he expected to bring forth good grapes, but it brought forth wild grapes. Your translation may use the word sour. That's the idea of the wild grapes. So instead of it producing good grapes, it produced sour grapes. In other words, it failed. That's the idea. And he's saying that Judah is like a vineyard that utterly failed. Now then, let's talk about, now verse 4, he raises the question, whose fault was it? Whose fault was it? So notice at verse 3, he said, O now inhabitants of Jerusalem, men of Judah, judge please between me and my vineyard. That's where he's making the comparison. You're like unto this failed vineyard. Now at verse 4, what more could have been done to my vineyard? Here is the vine dresser saying, what more could I have done for you? Could I have dug any more? No, I dug as much as I could. That I have not done in it. Why then, when I expected to bring forth good grapes, did you bring forth wild grapes? Now please tell me, what will I do to my vineyard? What more could I have done for you? And so God is saying to Judah, what more could I have done for you than what I did for you? I blessed you, I delivered you, I gave you direction, I sent prophets to you. I listened to your prayers, I answered your prayers, I delivered you in the days of the judges. What more could I have done for this nation than what I've done? And the answer is you couldn't have done anything else. God had done everything for them. And yet they utterly failed, just like this vineyard. So whose fault was it? The point is, it's the fault of Judah. They brought this on themselves. Now, at verses 5 and 6, he's going to raise the question now, what am I going to do with this vineyard? What am I going to do? Look at verse 5. And now please tell me what I will do with my vineyard. And so here's what he's going to do. I'll take away its hedge, and it shall be burned, and break down its wall, and it shall be trampled down. Where he had perhaps put a wall around to keep wild animals from coming in, wild animals now can come in. And so now it's going to be trampled by wild animals where it was protected before. I'm going to take down the hedge, I'm going to take down the wall. And I will lay it waste, verse 6. I'm not going to prune, I'm not going to dig, and there'll be briars and thorns, and there'll be no rain upon it. And so I'm going to withhold the rain from it. I'm not going to, in other words, it's just going to grow up and just be a wild field is what it's going to be. Perhaps that picture is given a little bit later of this wild field, and we'll call our attention to that a little bit later. Now at verse 7 is God's disappointment. Now can you imagine the disappointment of the vine dresser who did everything he could to make the vineyard work, and then he comes looking for grapes at the time in the season that it's to produce, and he finds the wild grapes. So God said, I come looking for fruit, and I was so disappointed. Look at verse 7. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts, that's Judah. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel. And the men of Judah are his pleasant plant. He looked for justice, but behold oppression. He looked for righteousness, but behold weeping. Just like the man looked for good grapes, but he found wild grapes. Now, this is in the workbook. If you follow it, you'll find this in a footnote. There's a play on words, and I give this quotation from H.C. Loophole. Loophole suggested that, and notice that the play on words, it has to do with the similar spelling and the similar sound of the Hebrew words. And so he looked for mispat, suppose that's how it's pronounced, and behold mispatch, or mispak. So you see a similarity. There was a play on words. In other words, he looked for justice, but that justice became bloodshed. And he looked for whatever this Hebrew word may be, and then there came, and here's a very similar word to that. And so, dropping on down in the quotation, if you translated that to some kind of similar English, he looked for measures, but he found massacres. He looked for right, and he found riot. In other words, there's a play on words here in the Hebrew suggesting he went looking for this, but he found something that sounds very similar, but it was just the opposite of that. So he looked for right, but he found riot, or he found something rotten. So that's the idea. It was a failed vineyard, verses 1 to 7. God was so disappointed when he came and he found what he found. Now then, let's move to the series of 6 woes found in verses 8 through 23. Now this is directly related here. The series of 6 woes is directly related, and the question is how? Some think that these series of 6 woes are the wild grapes that were produced. In other words, they should have been producing service to God. That's what the good grapes would have been. They should have been obedient to God. That would have been the good grapes. They should have been honoring God. That would have been the good grapes. But what did they produce? They produced greed and materialism, drinking and careless living, enslaved to sin, being defiant to God, moral confusion, arrogance, and perversion of justice. Now, we're going to go through all of those and look at the verses, but perhaps that is the wild grapes. Perhaps that is the sour grapes that have been produced. Make sense? All right. Now let's start with verse 8 now. Here is a series of woes. And the first, I just simply call greed and materialism. This is what's going on in Judah. What's going on? Well, woe to those who join house to house and who add field to field, and there is no place where they may dwell alone in the midst of the land. And in my hearing, the Lord of hosts said, truly many houses shall be desolate, great and beautiful ones without habitation. Now we'll come back to verse 10 and get the point that's being made there. Here is the idea of greed. And the idea of greed is that property owners are just acquiring more and more. They acquire a house, and because of greed, they acquire another house. And they acquire land, and they acquire more land, and then more land, and then more land, to the point that some have suggested that there was no place for the poor to live. Perhaps that's the case. So the woe is given. And he's saying that you're full of greed. You're focused on acquiring for yourself rather than serving God, is the idea. So there's greed and materialism. Now, let me stop and footnote here. That I want you to notice all through these chapters, and every chapter as we go on through the book of Isaiah, how much parallel there is to our own day and time. Men's no different. This is the problem that's going on in our own society. There's greed given to materialism. Say more about that here in just a second. But notice he said, here's what's going to happen. They're going to be desolate. You're going to lose what you have. And he said, for 10 acres of a vineyard shall yield 1 bath, and a homer of seed shall yield 1 ephah. In other words, it'll only produce about 1/10 of what it should. So woe to those who are given to greed and materialism. You're going to pay a price for that. The time is coming, and coming soon, when what all that you're acquiring will only be worth about 1/10 of what you think it's worth. Well, we're eat alive with materialism in our own society. Brethren who go, for example, to the Philippines and go preach in the Philippines tell me that the success they have in the Philippines is largely due to the fact that they're not eaten alive with materialism like we are in America. And they go and they preach, and people are not interested so much in the sports. They're not interested in things and stuff because they don't have money for things and stuff. But what they are interested in are spiritual things because they're in poverty. And so you talk to people in our society, and they have things and stuff and entertainment, and we're eaten alive with greed and materialism and hedonism. All right, let's move to the second one. Beginning at verse 11, there's drinking and careless living. I don't think that's just a parallel to some things, but that was the sin itself of drinking and careless living. Woe to those who rise early in the morning that they may follow intoxicating drink, and who continue until night, till the wine inflames them. Now this is how far they've gone. They've gone so far that they rise early and drink, and they drink till the late at night, where throughout the scriptures it was quite common for those that would get drunk in the night. You remember references to that. But they're rising early and getting drunk and continuing into the night. And then notice he says the wine inflames them. They're without self-control. Now you think of a society where people are drinking and then there's without self-control. There is no self-control because of their drinking and their carousing. But let's go further. Look at verse 12. The harp and the string and the tambourine and the flute and the wine are in their feast. Well, what does that suggest to you? Well, that suggests that they're feasting and reveling in interest of their own pleasure, doing whatever they want. So they're drinking, there's careless living. Consequently, they do not regard the work of the Lord nor consider the operation of His hands. They're not giving any consideration to the revealed will of God, God's desire. And if you're following in the workbook, I'm just going to basically summarize or quote what I've put in the workbook because I think this summarizes the thought. That they have no regard for the fact that God plans to bring the Messiah into the world through this nation. They have no interest in that. They're unconcerned about any laws regarding or dangers or warnings about drinking, wine, and careless living. They care very little about their hedonistic practices and how it's deteriorating the nation. They don't care about that. And that's the point being made at verse 12. Now, at verse 13 beginning, he said they're going to go into captivity. You might underline this, because they have no knowledge. Why do they have no knowledge? They have no knowledge because they're not interested in the things of God, verse 12. A parallel verse to that would be Hosea chapter 4 and in verse 6. My people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge. They don't care. They've rejected. They're not interested. They have no interest in the revelation of God. Now notice what's going to happen here. The honorable men are famished, and the multitude dried with thirst. What does that suggest to you? Those that were so interested in acquiring so much for themselves are going to come to the point they're doing without, and they're dying of thirst. So Sheol opens up its mouth to swallow them up, anything that will be received. Now notice verse 15 and 16. Now this is interesting. The people will be brought, starting at verse 15, people shall be brought down, each man shall be humbled, and the eyes of the lofty shall be humbled. God is going to bring judgment on them, and He's going to bring them down, and He's going to humble them. But notice the next phrase because it's directly connected. And the God who is holy shall be hallowed in righteousness. The same punishment that brings down man and humbles him exalts and vindicates God. Now let's footnote again. And the footnote I want to make here is the fact that we often look at prophets of doom, particularly like Jeremiah. Isaiah comes in that category, but more Jeremiah than Isaiah. But we read about a prophet of doom, and we get discouraged and say, this is just doom and destruction and sin. And I'd like something encouraging. Every prophecy that is a prophecy of doom also exalts God's righteousness. Does that make sense? Though this is a lecture, nodding is still permissible. Does that make sense? That anytime God pronounces doom, that's an exaltation of God's holiness and God's righteousness. So you say, well, I read this prophecy and it's so discouraging because it's just a prophet of doom. Sure, it is a prophecy of doom, but that just exalted my God. And so I'm encouraged by that. I'm uplifted by that. All right, now let's go beginning at verse 18 and 19. They're enslaved to sin and they're defiant toward God. They're enslaved in sin. Now this is an interesting expression. Woe to those who draw iniquity with cords of vanity and sin as with a new cart rope. Now this reminds me of 2 Corinthians 6 and 14, being yoked together with an unbeliever, which has to do with being yoked like the yoke of oxen and pulling a load of sin. What he's picturing here at verse 18, it's like they have, they're so tied, they have strong ties to sin. So strong, it's like they have carts of sin that are tied to them, and everywhere they go, they're pulling this cart of sin behind them. And so they're so engrossed in sin, they're so enslaved to sin, that it's like they're carrying sin with them everywhere they go. They have strong ties to sin. Now, at verse 18, and they say, this is what the scoffer says, let him make speed and hasten his work. In other words, any warning from God about captivity or about punishment, bring it on. Bring it on. We don't care. They're scoffers. They really don't believe that God's going to do that. So, in other words, they're defiant toward God. That's the point I want you to see. That's a defiant spirit. And let the counsel of the Holy One draw near and come, that we may know it. In other words, if God's going to punish us, bring it on. Kind of like someone, you tell them, if you practice that sin, you're going to go and spend eternity in hell. I'm not afraid of hell. They're defiant toward their God. All right, now let's talk about the moral confusion at verse 20. At verse 20, there's moral confusion because as men go further into sin, the moral distinctions are all blurred. Look at verse 20. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, put darkness for light and light for darkness and bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Well, that fits our day and time. Capital punishment, which God approves of, is said to be evil and wrong. Abortion is a glorious thing. That's a right that we need to defend. And so here is the killing of a baby is said to be good. The killing of a criminal is said to be bad, which God said was good. So they call evil good and good evil. And on we could go with illustrations of that very point. Proverbs 17:15 would be a parallel principle to that. So here is the moral confusion. All right? Now then, there is arrogance at verse 20. These all go hand in hand. Look at verse 21. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and prudent in their own sight. That is, if I might quote from Haley, which I do in the workbook, that when a man ridicules the word of God and his prophet and then confuses the principles of good and evil, he becomes dependent on his own infallible, in fact, I have the quote here on the screen, his own infallible wisdom, which, since it is apart from God, is fatal in its consequences. What I wanted you to see is the progression that takes place. Because man ridicules God, he begins to confuse moral distinctions, and then he begins to think, you know what, my thinking is just as good or better than anybody else and better than God's. And so man begins to think in those terms. Now let's get the perversion of justice, and then we'll come back and summarize these 6 woes. That woe to men mighty at drinking wine, men valiant at mixing intoxicating drink, and they justify the wicked with a bribe, and they take away justice of the righteous man. Perhaps talking about some civil leaders, rulers, who are drinking so much they have no clarity of mind, and consequently, the righteous man is punished while the wicked is vindicated. And that well describes our own day and time. And so why is it that you get so frustrated when you know of a case going to court and things just seem to be skewed? It goes back a little bit further. It goes back perhaps to greed, to moral confusion, defiance toward God, man thinking he's smarter than God, and consequently then there is this perversion of justice. Now that's the series of 6 woes. But let's see if we can summarize those 6 woes in 4 points instead of 6. And that is, what was the problem with Judah? There was a great emphasis on the material rather than the spiritual. There was apathy toward God. They don't care what God said, and they ridicule what God said. And furthermore, they blur the lines of distinction, and then they're dependent on their own wisdom. I want to tell you, that sounds like 2022. And Isaiah was prophesying 700 to 740 years before Christ. And he was saying, this was the problem I'm dealing with. But if we could raise Isaiah from the dead and say, Isaiah preached that same sermon you preached to Judah, you'd think Isaiah had been living in our own day and time, wouldn't you? Because we're dealing with the same problem. Emphasis on the material, apathy toward God, and then blurring lines of distinction, and then depending on their own wisdom. Now let's talk about the third and final section of chapter 5. I think chapter 5, and I know we're spending more time here, we're going to pick up the pace when we get to chapter 7 and 8, because they go together, but I want you to get this picture, particularly this failed vineyard, and then the bad fruit they produced. Now, judgment comes from the nations because of that. Verses 25 to 30 to finish that chapter. Now, we won't spend quite as much time on this section, but notice the word therefore at verse 24. That suggests that the judgment he's about to mention is coming because of this series of woes. Because you have produced this fruit, then he mentions two things. There's two comparisons to start with, verses 24 and 25. That the judgment is compared to a fire that devours the stubble and consumes the chaff so that the root will be as rottenness. In other words, the fire is so thorough that the root is devoured of the plants and of the trees. The second illustration that he gives, or comparison, is the trembling hills. Notice this at verse 25. Now, we haven't skipped everything between, but notice, and the hills tremble, perhaps like an earthquake. And so there's some discussion and among commentators as to what that refers to. And if you're looking at the workbook, look at your footnote there from Haley and Loophole, where they suggest several possibilities. It could be internal rottenness, Haley suggests is one possibility. In other words, some natural calamity. Or it could have reference to a battle like the kings of Syria and Israel battling them, and so there's that oppression. Loophole thinks it's Assyria, as per chapter 7, and he may be right. That would seem to make sense, but I'm not sure. Nor was Haley, nor was any other that could say that they know for certain exactly what all that was included in. In other words, but the point is, judgment is coming because of that. Now let's talk about the reason. Go back to verse 24. Here's the reason for the judgment. Notice at verse 24, that because, I'm at the end of verse 24, they have rejected the law of the Lord of hosts and despised the word of the Holy One of Israel. That's the bottom line. That's why judgment is coming. Now then, this is an interesting phrase at verse 25. You'll see this again. In fact, if you want to make a note where you're going to see it again, you're going to see it in Isaiah 9, verse 12, 9 in verse 17, and 9 in 21. So 12, 17, and 21 verses of chapter 9, you see the same phrase. And the phrase is, for all this, his anger is not turned away, and his hand is stretched out still. What does that refer to? It just simply means his judgment. This is not all there is to his judgment. God would, with reference to Judah and Israel both, there would be judgment in time. This not the utter and final judgment on the nation. In other words, they're not going into captivity. This nation's not going to be destroyed. A nation will oppress them. They will have pestilence, or they may have other forms of judgment. But his, how's it worded here? For his anger is not turned away. Why is the anger not turned away? They didn't repent. And his hand of wrath is stretched out still. That's the idea. His hand of wrath is still outstretched. So God's not done. God's not through. There's more coming. That's the idea. So, I have no evidence that God is punishing us when he allows something to happen tragic to us, but he could judge a nation in the sense that he rules in the kingdoms of men. But it could be that whatever happens to this nation of ours, that God's hand is still outstretched. It's stretched out still. I like the wording of that. His hand is stretched out still. God's not done with us. So there may be some form of judgment. There may be some form of suffering we go through, but his hand is stretched out still. I've seen no evidence of repentance. I've seen no evidence of change. His hand is stretched out still. God's not done. Now I want you to notice at 26 to 30 to finish this chapter that the enemy nations will be used to bring this about. The enemy nations are going to bring this about. I just want to highlight one verse that makes this point, or a couple of verses. In verse 26, that he will lift up a banner to the nations and will whistle to them from the ends of the earth. In other words, it's like God whistling and telling them, come on, nations, and bring the judgment up on Judah. And he's going to whistle for them, and they're going to come. It's going to be like the whirling of the roaring of the sea, and the sound of the chariots would be like the whirlwind, is what he describes here in these verses. All right, let's move on now to the second section, and this is Isaiah's vision and his call. So let's get his vision, and then we'll talk about his call to be a prophet. So what happens in his vision, verses 1 to 4? Well, in his vision, he first of all dates this vision in chapter 1 in the year that King Uzziah died. That's about 739 BC. Some say 740 to 739 BC. So he's called about 740, 739. You put whatever date there. I'm not going to argue, nor can I argue over 1 year, but I think 739 is generally the date to be thought that he died. And so what he saw, he said, is that he saw the Lord on his throne, and in his robe filled the temple, and there were stood seraphim. Each had 6 wings. This is a high order of angels, and each one of them had 6 wings. And with 2 of the wings he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And so this begins to sound like some of the apocalyptic literature. And what does that refer to? Well, the bottom line is, we're not told, and we're not sure. But very similar to some other uses of seraphim in the Old and New Testament as well, like in Revelation, Hark suggests that perhaps the covering of their face was for reverence to not look upon God. Covering their feet may have been a sign of humility, and with 2 they flew may suggest the idea of moving out and carrying out and doing God's will. Whatever the case, the point is there is the absolute holiness of God, and then he said he saw the smoke that was filled with smoke. That is, the house was filled with smoke, that is, the smoke of the wrath of God. He heard them say, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God of hosts." Haley makes the observation that 3 being a divine number, that's absolute holiness. And so it's not just holy, but holy, 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 absolute holiness. The highest form of holiness is attributed to him. So he's overwhelmed with the greatness of God, and he sees the smoke of the wrath of God. Now, having seen that, notice his, and I borrow this from, I can't remember now if this was from Haley or from John Humphreys. I believe John Humphreys mentioned this to me several years ago, of the woe and the low and the go. And that is, this is based on the King James rendering of this. So notice he says at verse 5, his reaction was, "Woe is me, for I am undone." Recognizing the greatness of God made him realize his own sin, and he's undone. His low, as found in verse 6, the New King James says, "Behold, this has touched your tongue," where he took the coal, that is the seraphim, flew and took the coal from the altar and touched his tongue. And the King James says, "Lo." So we're making a play on words based on the King James. So, "Woe is me, lo, this has touched your lips." And then at verse 9, he said, "Go and tell this people." There's your woe, lo, and go. Now, what's the lo about? Or behold. In other words, he was cleansed. And there's a practical thing to be learned from that. Before anyone is ready to do the will of God, especially take the message of God to someone else, they must be first cleansed and set apart to the service of God. No one's ready to do that until they're cleansed. But then he says, "Go." And God had raised the question, "Who shall go for us?" And Isaiah responded saying, "Here am I, send me." We sing a song based on that. "Here am I, send me." That ought to be the cry of every disciple. "Here am I, send me." I'm ready to go. You asked me to go. So here's his commission and his cleansing to prepare him for the work. And then who are we going to send with the message? And Isaiah said, "I'm here, send me." And so God sends him. But now guess what God says about that? Look at verse 9. He said, "Go and tell the people." And now you see this is quoted in the New Testament and applied to the Pharisees, though that wasn't the original application. This applied to Judah. And that is, keep on hearing and do not understand, seeing and don't perceive. and the ears are heavy, and their eyes will be shut. In other words, Isaiah, you're going to go preach to a people that are going to shut their ears to what you're saying. They're not going to listen to you. They're not going to pay attention to you. And so Isaiah said, how long? How long? What's he asking? He might be asking, how long am I to continue to preach? It's more likely he's saying, how long until this nation to whom I preach is completely hardened? And this is the only time that I know God answers this question. He said, until the cities are laid waste. In other words, let me summarize and put it in simple terms. God tells Isaiah, you keep preaching till there's nobody to preach to. That's a powerful point. You keep preaching till there's nobody to preach to. So what if you're trying to teach your neighbors and friends and you say, well, nobody's listening to me? You just keep talking to people about the gospel until there's nobody to talk to. As long as there's somebody to talk to, let's keep doing our job of talking to other people about the gospel. Well, that's Isaiah's commission. Well, I'm getting behind, so let's talk about the final section, the threat of Syria and Ephraim. Now, just a quick summary of history here. And you remember how when Assyria threatened Israel, the northern kingdom, we talked about that in our introduction, that Syria was threatened as well as Israel was threatened by Assyria. Don't confuse Syria, starting with an S, and Assyria, starting with A. Assyria, A, was threatening both Syria, with an S, and Israel. And so Syria and Israel formed a coalition, though they had been enemies, and said, we're going to fight against Assyria. So they go to Jotham, the king, and ask him to join with them, and he refuses. So when Jotham is dead, the next king was Ahaz, and they come to him, and they threaten him, and fight with him, or threaten to fight with him, so that they will get him to join the coalition to fight against Assyria. Ahaz calls for Assyria to come and help him fight against Syria and Israel. Make sense? Instead of turning to God, he turns to Assyria. So, we're going to have to quickly get this. First of all, Syria and Ephraim threaten Judah, verses 1 to 16. Ahaz is assured that Syria and Ephraim will not succeed, verses 1 to 9. And so God tells him that they are like firebrands. He says, take your son, Shir-Jasub, and you take him, and you remember what his name meant, that you're to take Shir-Jasub, he said, whose name means a remnant shall return, and you go and you tell Ahaz this message. And what's the message? Take heed, verse 4, be quiet, in other words, be calm, and do not fear, because he calls these two nations, Syria and Israel, firebrands. In other words, they're going to burn out. They're not going to last. They're not going to threaten you. They'll have no more power than what they have right now. They're not going to overtake you. They're not going to bother. Just have confidence. And so let us go up to Judah and trouble it, they said, and we'll set a king. They were going to topple Ahaz and put Tabel in as a ruler who they could control. And so his assurance is that these two nations are not going to stand and it's going to be established. So now start at verse 10. Ahaz is offered a sign. Ask for any sign you want that this is going to be true, and I'll give it to you, God said. And Ahaz said, notice this at verse 10, or verse 12, I will not ask, nor will I test God. Now that's a bunch of nonsense. Because this is the same man who may have already made an agreement with Assyria. No, he acts like, this is hypocrisy, by the way. I wouldn't want to do anything to test God. In other words, he doesn't want to see the evidence that this is true. He doesn't want to see the evidence. And he's let it be known that whatever evidence is given, I'm not interested in. I don't want to see the evidence. So God turns and said, I will give a sign to you, verse 14. You might circle the word you. I will give you a sign. That's plural. Now he's not talking to Ahaz. He's talking to the house of David. And the sign was that a virgin would conceive and bear a son. Now we can spend the rest of this week, which is only just a few minutes, and the rest of next week and the next talking about Isaiah 7:14. I know Isaiah 7:14 is a prophecy of the Messiah. Mark it as a messianic passage. I know it is because Matthew 1 quotes this passage and applies it to Jesus who was born of a virgin. I know it's talking about that. I have no doubt, 100%. And you have no doubt either. So if you're filling out the handout sheet, you'll have something there about what passage. There's a passage missing. It's Matthew 1. So Matthew 1 tells me that this is talking about the Messiah. It's a messianic passage. And so how is that going to be? Well, when it finally comes to pass, they'll know that God had given a sign and preserved his people. The family of David will know it. But Ahaz, it wouldn't matter. Some think it's talking about a child being born in the time of Ahaz. It wouldn't have mattered because Ahaz has already said he wouldn't accept any evidence. Now, the message about the infancy of the Messiah is that by the time, notice the wording here at verse 15, before the child, verse 16, before the child shall know refuse good and evil, the dread shall be forsaken from both her kings. In other words, that these two kings that you are afraid of, Syria and Israel, are not going to last. How long is it going to be before they fall? The time that from a child being born till they know right from wrong, that short of a time, they're going to fall. And they're not going to be a threat to you at all. And so that's the point. Here were the signs that were given, but it didn't mean a thing to Ahaz. Ahaz makes a confederacy or an alliance with Assyria nonetheless. Now, let's go to chapter at the end of chapter 7. The Lord sends destruction through Assyria. So Assyria is going to threaten and have an impact upon Judah. And Maher-shalal-Hashbaz is going to be a sign that that's going to come. Chapter 8, verses 1 to 10. And so God uses the sons of Isaiah to make his point, just like he did in earlier part of chapter 7. You take with you Maher-shalal-Hashbaz, which means the spoil speedeth and hasten to come. And so here in chapter 8, Maher-shalal-Hashbaz was a sign that Judah is going to be not destroyed, but is going to be invaded by Assyria. I want you to notice now, I think we've got time to make this point, that in verse 6, or verse 7, I'm in chapter 8, verse 5, 4 and 5, that the point is that Damascus, that's Syria, and Israel, Samaria, will be taken away before the king of Assyria. Assyria is going to come and take them away. They're not going to be a threat to you. And notice that in verse 6, that inasmuch as these people refuse the waters of Shiloh that flow lofty and rejoice in Rezin and in Remaliah's son. In other words, they put their confidence in other kings and in other nations rather than putting their confidence in God. Now, with that in mind, I want you to notice down beginning at verse 11. Here's the point at verse 11 starting. At verse 11, the point made to Isaiah is fear God and not man. This is the whole part of the whole point of the book of Isaiah. You need to put our confidence in God and not in another nation. So he said, for the Lord has spoken to me with a strong hand and instructed me that I should not walk in the ways of the people. What were they saying? Do not say a conspiracy concerning this people. In other words, Isaiah had been accused of a conspiracy against the king of Judah because he had told them not to put their confidence in other nations. So now notice at verse 13, here's the key. The Lord of hosts, him shall you hallow, let him be your fear, let him be your dread. In other words, fear the Lord. Have your confidence in God and not in the nations. Have your confidence in God and not in Assyria. Have your confidence in God and not in Syria or Israel. That's what Israel wanted. Band with us and put your confidence in us and not in God. And Assyria said, no, you put your confidence in me and I'll fight against your other two enemies. And Isaiah is being told by God, put your faith and confidence in me and not in man. So then he's told to bind up the testimony and wait on the Lord. This is an interesting phrase at verse 17, and I will wait on the Lord. What does that mean? I'm going to wait and let the Lord do what he promised to do. God said he'll deliver his people, and I'm going to put confidence that the Lord is going to do what he said he would do. And then he closes on the folly of a false religion. The false religion in this context is putting your confidence in man and in idolatry, but your confidence in man and not in God. That's a hurried summary of chapter 7 and 8. But hopefully what you've seen is the condemnation of Judah, the call of Isaiah, and then here's the threat of Syria and Ephraim. And you don't need to have any concerns about them. They're going to fall. Just trust me, God is saying. Trust me. Just trust me. They're going to fall. Don't put your confidence in Assyria.